resource-intensive things. One thing that's very interesting to look at from the 1989 perspective is that we're now looking at a much more compressed time frame. So speed actually is of the essence. So
6 weeks instead
of
6 weeks instead of
17 days. 6 weeks instead of 6 months. I mean, it felt like it happened at lightning speed in 1989 in the Eastern Bloc, and it actually took 6 months. And we're seeing that at a much greater speed now.
We know that revolutions are highly contagious events, and that they spread very quickly. You know, in 1848, we had a series of revolutions in Europe, you know, before television and radio and Twitter, right? Again, this is not a feature of social media. This is a feature of how revolutions spread.
It's only 17 days if you discount April 6th of 2008, and if you're counting from there, it's only 2 years unless you don't pay attention to Kafaya in 2004. I mean, the public sphere, the densifying of the public sphere in advance of the revolution matters as much to whether or not an uprising turns into a revolution or not as the events on the ground. So it is the long game, the long game of the social environment of a country matters as much, and I think the effect of these tools matters as much for that question of the public sphere as it does for the theater of collapse.
So we'll agree that the marriage that's happened between social movements for social justice with social networks has reinvented Egypt as we see it today.
Why do we need a definitive answer to all these questions?
It's television. Let's leave it with a question.
I mean, really.
Questions, please.
Don't you think that especially younger people will always be more advanced in using technology than governments?
Well, I mean, look at Iran in 2009, right? There were plenty of young people supplied with technology, right? Again, if you have a lot of thugs out beating them up, no amount of feeding will probably help, right? You do need other forces. You do need to have the army on your side, or, you know, some other factors. So looking at history, again, it's very useful to look at Facebook-driven revolutions which did not succeed. Again, now in Syria, we see a lot of presence on Facebook. There are a lot of Facebook groups with hundreds of thousands of members. They did not translate into real-world protests. You know, what we see are only the success stories. You do not see the failures. And there are many more cases, you know, from Belarus, where I come from, to plenty of cases in Central Asia, and many of cases in the Middle East itself.
Also, it's an uprising against, I don't even want to call it mainstream media anymore, because I don't think the mainstream media has represented the mainstream. You know, they have state media in Egypt. In the United States, we don't have state media, but you'd have to ask, in this country, if we had state media, how would it be any different? So when you have the protests, February 15th, 2003, before the war in Iraq, right? Millions of people rocked the globe for peace right before the U.S. attacked Iraq. And yet you get, at best, a major picture on the front page of the papers. You see millions of people screaming. Most people don't identify with that. But when you hear someone talking, and when was the last time you see these grassroots activists brought into not the mainstream media, but the corporate media's halls to explain themselves, to give a face, a name? It's letting people speak for themselves instead of what we get on all of these networks. This small circle of pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong.
I want to try to come back at that for a minute. I just come from 3 hours of being on the air. The commentary that I heard and what I saw on CNN earlier nights was watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world in all these outlets. To say that the coverage was pro-revolutionary would be an understatement. To say that there was some kind of corporate tarring of the demonstrators would be wild fantasy.
Well, you're making a very, very important point, but I also have observed this, how different it is. Because what happened this time in Egypt is that hosts and anchors went to Egypt. They were beat up. From the United States. They were beat up. They were imprisoned. They had their cameras smashed. And suddenly, the very people, the people that they usually turn to when they're here, and I'm saying the voices of power, the Mubarak regime, who they would usually be interviewing, they're the ones who beat them up. And so they, for the first time, did not see them as legitimate. And so you started to see in the mainstream media, the corporate media, They're looking for the very voices that we're broadcasting all the time. I call it trickle-up journalism.
What about Vietnam? What about the press in Vietnam, in particular?
You're taking us backward. We're going to move forward. We're going to move forward. We're going to move on to Sudan next.
We've done some bad things, but don't tar us for everything we've done.
Please.
I think some of the most important news stories that we've gotten recently have not come from the traditional news outlets. The native video has come just organically through the internet, and I think the people have kind of shown that they have the ability to say, we see this is important, and we're going to bump it up in importance, and it gets out there within a day.
There is simply too much information to indulge in the fantasy that you can have unfiltered access to everything. The organic movement that you're talking about is a form of filtering, in which things that get retweeted, reblogged, passed on, and sort of rise up, that is simply an alternate form of filtering. But don't believe either that we don't need filters or that we could live without them. And I don't think that we should be as naively assuming the quality of the organic filters as we were in the 20th century, when we simply assumed that Walter Cronkite was, when he told us that that's the way it is, that statement was at all accurate. But now that we know that that statement is nonsense, we shouldn't also imbue that same sense of, oh, therefore it must be true, when looking at our social networks.
Go ahead, Emily.
I just want to say something sort of slightly in defence of our students and also the existing corporate media and of journalism, which is actually being able to relate narrative and data, which is actually going to be a kind of a relatively difficult job. And I thought the WikiLeaks prism of that was a great one, because, as I say, you just saw the future, which is information will come to you in ugly big chunks, and you have to be able to make sense of it, and you have to be able to make people care about it. And actually, you need people who are paid money to spend time with stories to be able to do that, and those are really kind of what professional journalists do.
Please.
So I guess I'm curious about the role that you think the internet and social media will have moving forward. I mean, obviously, it's been very useful in getting rid of Mubarak and mobilizing people around that. But how do you think it can be harnessed and utilized going forward in terms of what happens next in Egypt?
I had the opportunity to talk to several of the recent Tunisian ministers who were on a panel where they were introduced by their name, their title, and the number of hours they had been in office, which was interesting. But Sami Zawi in particular, who was the Secretary of State, and I talked to him as the Secretary of State for Communications, and he got his back up. He said, no. In Tunisia, the old Secretary for Communications was responsible for stopping communications. I am the Secretary of State for Communications Technology. I'm here to support it. So one of the things we may see in these governments is a commitment to make these tools more directly accessible to their citizens in a less fettered way. The Tunisians are certainly planning on doing that. Whether the Egyptians do or not, I don't know, but I think we could all hope that would happen.
And I can only say on Egypt, I can't think of a more important role for journalists than in this post-Mubarak time. They are going to be the check and balance on power. It is not predetermined what's going to happen now. It was a people's